what the French call le plaisir d'être ensemble, the pleasure of being together, for example. In other words, I don't want to rule out possibilities that there might be other agendas, but go ahead with your example.
That's right. Okay, so we go out and we enjoy the pleasures of being together, but we do that explicitly with the people about whom we say we're just friends, with the little quotation marks. We don't, when we're on a date, the whole point is to enjoy the pleasures of our company without being just friends. Okay, but look, when you're out on a date with somebody, and I guess I'm not so committed to the idea that it's the prospect of sex in the offing. If you'll grant me that it's more than being just friends, that's good enough for my purposes. Because here's where the bad faith comes in. On the one hand, the whole point of its being a date is that you go out with the person in order to explore the prospect of being more than just friends. On the other hand, you don't want to put yourself at risk, and so you constantly maintain the illusion in the actual behaviors that you engage in with the other person that so far, for all that's been done, it could be that we're still just friends. And you always want that out. And that's why it sounds so jarring to say that the point of the date is to decide whether to have sex together, because it's also part of the point of the date to maintain deniability about that very fact. And so we're deeply built into bad faith in the whole enterprise. And the way the bad faith works is to trade on what's actually undeniably true about me versus, the future that this interaction is really pointing to.
Yeah, well, these, again, examples take on a life of their own, and they can be, we can argue about the example and what's at stake in whether a date it has this underlying sort of decision that has to be taken, and that whether the people out on a date are conspiring to suppress that, or whether a date can be another kind of just the sheer aesthetic pleasure of flirtation, for example, which could be justification enough. But rather than get caught up in the detail, the idea of the coquette, because you're referring to that analysis of La Coquette, who tells herself that, yes, he's reaching for my hand, but he's not, he's reaching for it in an affectionate way, or he's that she has this capacity to lie to herself. The same way the waiter who is serving at the cafe, and he is dressed in his waiter's uniform, and he's balancing his tray the way a waiter is. He's playing the role, and he's so identified with the role of the waiter that he refuses to acknowledge the fact that at any moment he could just go back into the kitchen, throw his his coat away, and leave the place and embark on a different life altogether. Sartre later in his life, I think, came to regret the kind of cavalier attitude that he had towards the actual economic, material constraints that most people live under, and felt a little bit guilty about this, condemning the waiter who was serving him at the Café Flore, while he was writing his existentialist reflections. But nevertheless, what interests me is not only the individual psychology, and I think it's also a point of interest for you, Lanier, is the way in which a society as a whole can conspire to lie to itself and can bring about disasters within the sphere of political and social history that we then attribute to some kind of fate and want to say that we are not actually the architects of the calamities that befall us. No?
I think that's right. So, he operates with these trivial seeming interpersonal examples at the beginning when he's talking about bad faith. But he means to get down to a deep-going and quite serious consequence. And with the waiter, you see the beginning of that. I think you're exactly right. The beginning of it is that on the one hand, the waiter is sort of toying with the role of being a waiter and says to himself, oh, well, I could always do something else, even though he doesn't ever do something else, and some kind of serious constraining of his life is taking place, and he's conspiring with it without really admitting that to himself. But Sartre wrote this stuff not only in a certain economic context, but also in a very stark political context. He wrote these existentialist tracts during the Second World War, and some of the most outrageous sounding consequences that he draws from this theory of bad faith have to do precisely with the war. So he writes in Being and Nothingness things like, "We have the war we deserve. There are no innocent victims in war." So here's a longer quotation that I especially like.
What's he mean by that now? There are no innocent victims in war.
There are no innocent victims in war in the sense that we have the war we deserve. So the core question is what sense we can make of the idea that we actually deserve a social calamity that seems like this broad event that happens outside of our control. Here's the longer quotation, where you get some sense of what he meant by that. He says, "Thus there are no accidents in life. A community event like the war, which suddenly bursts forth and involves me in it, doesn't come from the outside. If I'm mobilized in a war, this war is my war. It's in my image and I deserve it. I deserve it first because I could always get out of it by suicide or by desertion. For lack of getting out of it, I've chosen it. But in addition, the war is mine," and this is, I think, the deeper point. "The war is mine because of the sole fact that it arises in a situation which I cause to be, and that I can discover the war there only by choosing to engage myself for it or against it." So I think that the thought is something like this. The war breaks out. A war is broken out in our life, too. The war breaks out, and then it's up to us to take up some attitude or other toward it. And if we choose to abandon other projects and make it our aim to get rid of this war or to endorse this war and fight it, then the war becomes central to us. If we choose that these other projects are more important and that it's just fine for us to go along as if there were no war happening, that too is a way of choosing this war, and the kind of war it turns out to be will be what it is because people made those choices. So in that sense, we have the war we deserve, and whoever the victims are, they were part of the set of choices that brought about a war of that sort. And so they aren't completely innocent.
Yeah. The more one knows about the origins and causes of World War II, and I've been reading a lot about it of late, also for some shows that I did in the fall, the more horrifying comes the realization that the war did not just break out. The war began as the consequence of an untold number of discrete or non-discrete decisions and choices that were made by individuals at all levels, from presidential political figures to bureaucrats to the military industrial establishment to actual citizens themselves and so forth. And that in a certain sense the notion that there is a tragedy involved in things like 60 million dead thanks to World War II, that it's not a tragedy in the classical sense of something that was decreed by the gods and that human beings are powerless against and have to suffer in a passive, passionate mode. That rather I think there's an overwhelming amount of evidence to support Sartre's basic doctrine that we have not only the war we deserve, but we also have the world we deserve. And it's as true now as it was in his time, and I think it was as true in his time as it was in Dante's time. And the reason I bring up Dante is because, strangely enough, Sartre called himself an atheist existentialist, and there was nothing more alien to Sartre than the concept of a providential God. But if you read the Divine Comedy, for example, Paradiso 3, Dante is in the circle of the moon of the souls who are saved, but they were inconstant in their vows. and he meets there a woman named Picarda, who was a Florentine woman who wanted to devote her life to God, went into the convent. Her brother went there and violently and forcibly drew her out of the convent and forced her to get married through sheer coercion and violence. And yet she has this blemish of inconstancy, because Dante says there that she could always have resisted. She could have allowed herself to die rather than be taken away from the convent. So as you said, suicide is always an option. Dante believed in very much the same way the unconditional freedom of human agency to create the world we deserve. And if there is a tragedy, it's not that things happen by the decree of God. The tragedy is that human beings screw it up time and again through their own choices.